Well, guys, today we're joined by Richard Brooks, who is the Vice President of NUS.
Yep,
is that right?
That's
Yeah.
right.
You've had an interesting week.
I have.
And I don't want to go too much into it, obviously, because I'm sure there's a lot of things that we can and we can't say, and I don't want to cross any lines in that regard. But in brief, how would you describe your week?
It's been quite tumultuous. It's been quite difficult. So I guess what I can say is, obviously, what's happened is over the last week is that a number of different allegations have surfaced about me. That I met someone in November time, I think it was, who I thought was a student and turned out to be an undercover reporter, which is not something you expect to happen in your life. You think it happens to the England manager and to government ministers. You don't expect it to happen to a student representative. Who filmed me basically saying things that I have said quite publicly, which is that I don't agree with our national president, nor do I agree with the direction that NUS is going in a number of different areas. And that led me to being accused of all sorts of different things, not least, and I think most prominently, that I am either on the payroll of or collude with the Israeli government, things which are fundamentally untrue. I can't go into too much detail about that, because what happened last week was that I willingly and myself put myself forward for an investigation which will be independent through NUS UK board structures to which I believe and hope will clear my name, but it's obviously entirely independent of me and will come up with its verdict insofar. But I guess it's just been a really difficult week, because when you try and articulate your point of view in terms of what you believe has happened and why, in particular the way in which we interact with each other on social media makes it very difficult, and I have been subject to, as have a number of other people, quite vile and quite violent tweets and Facebook messages and emails, and that's always difficult, and that's difficult for like my mum to see, for instance.
Yeah, so from what I could understand, please correct me if I'm wrong, it was just that an undercover reporter got clips of you saying that you disagreed with different things that the NUS president has said, has done. And then the bit that confused me the most, I don't know if I have the exact quote.
Sure.
The thing that confused me and I kind of wondered about was about the groups that are kind of mobilising against... Organising against Malia.
So the way NUS politics work, and exactly the same way that, any other form of politics work, is that when people have different, and at its most, I think, highbrow, when we have different visions of what NUS should look like, or different visions of whatever should look like, is that those people come together to organise, to agree policy positions, to support candidates, and so on and so forth. I do that. Every single other NUS officer does that. Every single elected person ever does it, because that is the nature of a political party. I've just described a political party, and obviously within that video articulated it probably in a way that you wouldn't do if you did publicly, but ultimately that is exactly what every single NUS officer does. And unfortunately what that's meant is that I have been labelled everything from a threat to national security all the way through to a danger to myself and other officers, and it's been very difficult. Yeah,
I can imagine. One of the quotes that I think I've got word for word. Again, correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the quotes that I got was, and I completely agree with it, but I'd kind of like some context.
Sure.
The quote is, "I could never have an elected leader who is racist." Is that suggesting in any way that the current leader is?
I was absolutely referencing, so the context of that is the fact that ever since April last year, and actually before that, is that Jewish students in particular up and down the country have time and time again repeatedly said, and I've repeatedly said publicly on national radio, that there are a number of really troubling and anti-Semitic things that have been said by this national president and Jewish students, like any other form of oppressed group, get to define their own oppression in that regard, and believe that rhetoric is troubling and would like an apology and a retraction and be able to move on. And what I was referencing there was very much the, I think, widespread belief by Jewish students that there is a real undercurrent and a sentiment, not just within NUS, but within the far left of the Labour Party, as well as other parts of, unfortunately, wider society. There are really troubling issues and instances of anti-Semitism and people who are using what are legitimate criticisms of the Israeli government, which very much wade into, I think, quite old school anti-Semitic tropes.
So you weren't saying that the current president of the NUS is a racist.
I was very much saying that that Jewish students have been saying that there is anti-Semitism, which is a form of racism.
Okay, good. So, but you have made your points fairly clear in that you don't necessarily agree. You're not eye to eye with
absolutely.
the current president.
Yeah. And I've publicly said that in speeches, in national press, and so on and so forth.
Okay, so but specifically the issue that you've had with Malia.
Mm-hmm.
Could you explain a little maybe where
Well,
your and her views differ slightly?
I think, and that this isn't. I think it's unhelpful to frame it as a me versus Malia thing, because insofar in that there has always been different political factions in the US, right? But I guess the difference insofar in that myself as I would be defined as a moderate officer of NUS, and then different parts of the far left of NUS is that I fundamentally believe in constructive engagement. I believe in being in the room, in negotiating, in compromise. I believe that you have to meet students where they are, not where you'd like them to be. And I would imagine that what different far left officers would say is that they believe that the system is broken, that the only way in which you get what you want is through signs of strength and power, through protest, through occupying, through changing the rules of the game.
So would you be able to give us an example? Is there a policy that you stand in one place on, and there are other members of NUS that are further away from you? Can you think of an example? Is there an example, or is it just?
Yeah, I mean, there are lots of different. One of the things that's quite interesting, I think, when you delve into the detail of stuff, is that often that when it comes to hard and fast policy positions, there won't always be a massive inextricable divide between different parts of NUS. So I guess an obvious example would always be about education funding. So most NUS officers, not all of them, but a fair amount, believe in free education, so no tuition fees. And actually, in reality, that will descend all the way to further education and apprentices and lots of different other parts of tertiary education. So most people agree on that. My view has always been that to get there, you need to win the argument about publicly funding universities, that you would need to have a graduate tax first, that you would need to compromise and negotiate, that would take quite a long time. And there's all sorts of different steps that you do. If you were to ask a officer who would be more of the far left, they would argue that that all that government ministers have done when we've tried that tactic, in their belief, has been to ignore us, and that we have been systematically had tuition fees raised, and that they think the only way of dealing with that as a problem would be by protests, mass walkouts, strikes and demonstrations. So a lot of the time it tends to come down to tactics, but also the sorts of things that you focus on.
Talking about the stuff that's happened during the week.
Sure.
The different stuff. Have you got any regrets?
I regret that I met someone who was I thought was a student activist and turned out to be an undercover reporter. And, I didn't think that sort of thing would happen to me. Are
there any regrets from your end? Obviously, you can't control the reporter.
No, I mean, I regret very much the way in which some of the things that I said were framed. Like, everyone does the thing where they say things in private, or what they thought was private, and they wouldn't frame them the same way publicly. So I very much regret that, and I would never want to cause harm or discomfort or anything of that ilk to anyone else at NUS, all of whom of us are here to try and represent and get the best deal for students in whatever way we think. I don't regret fundamentally what I said, because I don't think any of that's new. I don't regret how I reacted, because fundamentally I am not colluding with the Israeli government, and will always defend that as a point of principle and honour. And I guess I regret mainly from the entirety of the scenario is that this is again what I imagine people will use as another example of NUS not working, NUS not functioning, NUS is spending all of its time fighting each other, in particular about the Middle East, as opposed to representing students. And I very much believe that we should be, and if students want to talk about, for instance, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, in particular Jewish and Muslim students, I think we should absolutely allow a space for people to do that. Like, I fundamentally believe that. What I do think happens when we do have those conversations is that, unfortunately, that people labour under the misconception that we spend all of our time talking about international conflicts, as opposed to what I imagine people would expect the National Union to be doing, which is housing, cost of living, making students' unions better, saving students money, campaigning and defending students, which is what I still believe we fundamentally do day in, day out.
Great stuff. Right, that's it from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Great stuff.